Hundreds of people disappear every year in American national parks. Most are found alive or dead, but some cases defy logic. People vanish into thin air, leaving behind only scattered belongings and unanswered questions. September 2006, Olympic National Park. A young couple disappears from their tent at night. Their clothes are found wrapped around a tree 2 miles from the camp. May 2009, Arches. An engineer from Denver walks to the tourist arch and never returns. His belongings are found in 3 different places where he could not have physically been. July 2012, Shenandoah. A man goes to the river to wash up for 15 minutes. An hour later, his shirt is found hanging on a branch upstream, but his body is nowhere to be found in the calm water. 3 stories, 3 national parks. 3 disappearances forced the Park Service to classify the materials and change the search protocols. What you're about to hear never officially happened. On the night of September 19, 2006, something took 2 young people from their camp in Olympic National Park. 3 days later, their belongings were found 2 miles from the campsite, wrapped around a pine tree 6 feet above the ground, in an area that searchers had already combed twice. What happened next prompted the Park Service to classify the case for 20 years. Alex Winter worked as a mechanic at an auto repair shop in Portland. Karen Mills was a nurse at a local clinic. They were ordinary people who had been dating for 2 years and were planning their wedding for the following spring. On September 18th, they registered at Olympic National Park for a 2-day camping trip at Ozette Lake. Caretaker Daniel Crawford still remembers their registration. The young couple, smiling and carrying backpacks, asked about the best places to park. He directed them to the north shore of the lake, where there were several equipped sites. They were last seen alive around 7 p.m. that same day. A family from Tacoma, who were camping at a nearby site, told investigators that the couple were sitting by the fire, quietly discussing something. The woman was preparing food in a metal bowl. The man was stacking firewood, a common sight at any campsite. On the morning of September 19th, the neighbors heard no sounds coming from their camp. By noon, the lack of signs of life began to worry them. When they got closer, the scene seemed strange. The tent was untouched, and the zipper on the entrance was closed. Inside, the sleeping bags lay crumpled, as if someone had gotten up abruptly. The backpacks were still there, along with documents, money, and food supplies. Everything was there. Both men should have had shoes on their feet, but their boots were neatly placed at the entrance to the tent. The fire had burned out completely. The ashes were cold, indicating that the fire had gone out many hours ago. A metal bowl with uneaten dinner stood on a folding table. The food in it was fresh, with no signs of animals. The family from Tacoma immediately notified the park ranger. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, an official search operation had begun. The initial search covered a radius of 1.5 miles from the camp. 12 rangers and volunteers combed the lake shore, trails, and dense areas of forest. No traces were found. The ground was soft enough after recent rains, but no barefoot prints or signs of a struggle were found. On the second day, the search was expanded to 3 miles. Tracking dogs from the county office were brought in. The dogs picked up the trail from the tent, but lost it after 100 yards in the direction of denser forest. Nothing further. It was as if the people had simply vanished. The head of the search operation, Ranger Michael Thorns, later admitted that he had never seen anything like it in his 15 years on the job. People don't disappear without a trace from an enclosed space, leaving all their belongings behind, especially if they are experienced hikers, which Alex and Karen were. They had many hikes in the Cascade Mountains under their belts. By the 3rd day of the search, the area had been expanded to 5 miles. 40 people were now involved in the operation, including mountain rescue specialists. They combed every ravine, every crevice, checking abandoned huts and old mines. And then they found the first thing. Volunteer Tom Harris was searching a dense forest area 3 miles northeast of the camp. The terrain was challenging. Steep slopes, fallen trees, thick undergrowth. It was an area that had already been checked on the 2nd day of the search. At a height of about 6 feet, wrapped around a thick branch of an old fir tree, hung a man's jacket, dark blue, fleece. In the inside pocket was the key to a 1988 Honda Civic, Alex's car. The jacket hung as if it had been deliberately tied to the branch. There were no tears or marks where it had caught on the bark. The fabric was clean, with no dirt or leaves. Harris immediately called his superiors. The area was cordoned off, and photographs were taken. A detailed search began within a 200-yard radius of the find. Half a mile further down the slope, they found a second item, half of a pair of women's jeans. Exactly half. The leg had been neatly torn off along the seam from the waist to the knee. The fabric looked worn, as if it had been dragged along the ground for a long time. No traces of blood. No other pieces of clothing. No signs that anyone had been there. The search continued for another week. They checked every square yard within a 7-mile radius. They brought in a helicopter, thermal imaging cameras, and additional dogs. The result was 0. The official case was closed a month later with the wording, "Disappearance as a result of an accident in the wild." The families received standard condolences and recommendations to hire a private investigator if they wanted to continue the search. But the story did not end there. A year later, Ranger Thorns received an anonymous call. A male voice, clearly local by its accent, gave the coordinates of a location 10 miles from Lake Ozette. He said that something was wrong with the ground there. Thorns went to check it out. The place was deep in the woods, where tourists rarely go. It was a small clearing surrounded by old cedar trees. In the clearing was a patch of land about 9 feet wide where no grass grew. The ground was dark, as if it had been burned, but there were no traces of a fire. Thorns took soil samples and sent them to the lab. The results showed increased acidity, but no toxins or chemicals. A biologist from the University of Washington explained this as a natural process of organic decomposition. But Thorns noticed another detail. Around the perimeter of the scorched area, in the soft forest soil, there were footprints. Not human, and not from any known animals. Round, about 6 inches in diameter, with 5 deep grooves around the edge, as if something large and heavy had stood there, leaning on clawed limbs. Thorns made plaster casts, but did not officially register them anywhere. In the winter of that year, reports began to come in from local residents. A farmer from the town of Forks said that his livestock was restless at night. Cows huddled together, and horses refused to go out to distant pastures. A hunter found a dead deer in the forest. The animal was lying on its back as if it had been carefully laid down. No wounds, no traces of predators. A veterinarian from Port Angeles performed an autopsy on a death from cardiac arrest. A healthy 2-year-old male. Another hunter reported strange sounds in the forest. Not growling, not howling. Something like a low-frequency hum that is felt more by the body than by the ears. The sound lasted for several minutes, then stopped. Thorns began his own unofficial investigation. He studied maps and compared all the reports. An interesting picture emerged. All incidents occurred within a 15-mile radius of Lake Ozette, all at night, all in areas where people rarely go. Thorns contacted colleagues from other national parks. It turned out that similar cases of tourist disappearances had been recorded in Olympic National Park every few years. Always couples or small groups, always without a trace, always with belongings found in unexpected places a few days later. Records of these cases were kept, but they were never compiled into overall statistics. No one looked for patterns. In 2008, Thorns was transferred to another park. Officially, it was at his own request. Unofficially, it was after he tried to raise the issue of systematic disappearances at a Park Service management meeting. He was replaced by a ranger who strictly followed instructions and didn't ask unnecessary questions. The last time anyone remembered the Winter and Mills case was in 2011. A group of biology students from Seattle were conducting research in the Lake Ozette area. One of them, Dave Connor, fell behind the group while studying soil samples. When they realized he was missing, they began a search. They found him 6 hours later, 3 miles from where he was supposed to be. Connor was sitting at the foot of a large cedar tree, staring straight ahead, unresponsive to voices. He was taken to a hospital in Port Angeles. Physically, he was fine, but he was unable to speak coherently for several days. When his speech returned, Connor told a strange story. He said he was studying moss samples when he heard a sound, low, vibrating as if coming from underground. Then there was a smell, sweetish, putrid, but not like decay. Connor went to the source of the scent. His memories ended there. The next thing he remembered was sitting under a tree surrounded by searchers. A medical examination revealed no injuries or exposure to chemicals. A psychiatrist diagnosed temporary dissociative amnesia, possibly caused by the stress of getting lost. But some details did not make it into the official report. Connor's clothes were clean, as if he had recently been washed. His boots were free of dirt, even though he had spent 6 hours in the woods. There were no scratches from branches or insects on his hands or face. And one more thing. When Connor was found, there was a metal bowl lying next to him. It was precisely the same as the one Alex Winter and Karen Mills used for their meals. The bowl was seized as evidence, but a week later it disappeared from storage. The official explanation was a cataloging error. Dave Connor graduated from college and became an environmentalist in California. He refuses to answer questions about that day. The Winter and Mills case officially remains open, but the active search was discontinued in 2007. The materials were transferred to the archives and classified for 20 years in accordance with internal instructions from the National Park Service. Lake Ose is still popular with tourists. Every year, hundreds of people set up camp there. Most return home with the usual impressions of a vacation in nature. But local rangers know one rule that is not written in any instruction manual. If tourists report a low hum in the forest or a strange sweet smell, they are immediately transferred to other campsites, far away from the northern shore of the lake. The families of Alex Winter and Karen Mills are still waiting for answers. The private investigators they hired have found nothing new. The case remains one of the most mysterious disappearances in the history of Olympic National Park. Whatever happened to the young couple that night in September 2006 is something the Park Service prefers to keep secret. On May 3, 2009, a man disappeared in Arches National Park. 4 days later, his belongings began to be found in places where he could not physically have been. The search operation lasted 2 weeks and yielded no results. Travis Howell seemed to have vanished into the desert, leaving behind only questions with no answers. Travis Howell worked as a design engineer for a construction company in Denver. He was 36 years old, divorced, and had no children. Colleagues described him as a reliable, methodical person who did not make spontaneous decisions. In 10 years of work, he had never been late for a meeting and always gave advance notice of his plans. On May 1st, he took a week's vacation. He told his secretary that he was going on a solo camping trip to Utah and would be back in 7 days. He did not specify the route, but mentioned Arches National Park. Howell arrived at the park early in the morning on May 2nd. He registered at Devil's Garden Campground and was assigned site number 43. Caretaker Jim Kelly remembers his registration, a middle-aged man with graying temples, neat and polite. He asked about the difficulty of the trails and the closing time of the visitor center. The first 2 days passed without incident. His camping neighbors saw Howell in the mornings. He got up early, made coffee on a portable stove, and studied a map of the area. He looked like an experienced hiker, with high-quality equipment and confident behavior. On the morning of May 4th, he approached the tent of the Johnson family from Arizona. He said he was planning to hike to 00 Arch, a popular tourist route about 3 miles long. He asked them to watch his things if he didn't return by evening. It was 8 a.m. The route to 00 Arch is considered moderately complex. It is a well-marked trail popular with hikers. On average, the round trip takes 4 hours, including stops for photos. The weather that day was perfect. Clear, around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, no wind. Howell was supposed to be back by 2 o'clock. By 4, the Johnsons began to worry. By 6 in the evening, they notified the park ranger. The initial search began at 7 in the evening. 2 rangers walked the entire route to 00 Arch and back with flashlights. No sign of Howell. The trail was dry, and the tracks on it were mixed up from the many tourists who had passed through during the day. The next day, the search operation was expanded. 8 rangers, 4 volunteers from the local search and rescue team, and 2 rock climbing experts combed not only the main route, but also the side branches, ravines, and rock niches. The search area covered 5 square miles around the trail to Double O Arch. It was rocky desert terrain, typical of this part of Utah. Red sandstone cliffs, sparse bushes, minimal vegetation. The terrain was open, making it difficult to hide there. The first discovery was made on the second day of the search. Ranger Martin Flynn examined an area 1.5 miles from the main trail. Under a small rock ledge lay a plastic water bottle and a black leather wallet. The bottle was half empty. There were fingerprints on the label, which forensic analysis later confirmed belonged to Howell. The wallet contained a driver's license, credit cards, and $130 in cash. Everything was there. No signs of robbery. The location of the items was strange. They lay under a ledge that was off the beaten track. To get there, one would have had to deliberately turn off the trail and walk across rugged, rocky terrain. Why an experienced hiker would need to go there is unclear. Flynn carefully examined the site of the discovery. The rocks around it were arid with no traces of blood or struggle. There were no footprints in the sand. The ledge was about 10 feet high, but there were no signs of a fall. The items were neatly arranged, as if they had been placed there on purpose. The search continued with redoubled energy. The site of the discovery became the new center of the search area. Every crevice and cave within a mile radius was checked. Bloodhounds were brought in from Salt Lake City. The dogs picked up the trail from where the wallet was found, but lost it after 300 yards. Nothing further. It was as if the man had reached a certain point and disappeared. On the 4th day of the search, a second discovery was made. Volunteer Sarah Connolly searched an area 2 miles north of where the wallet was found. The location is even more remote, where tourists rarely venture. In a slight depression between red rocks on fine sand lay a pair of sunglasses. The glasses were in perfect condition. The lenses were clean, without scratches, and the frame was undamaged. They looked as if they had just been taken off and carefully placed there. Howell's fingerprints were found on the arms. Connolly carefully examined the site of the discovery. The sand around the glasses was smooth, with no traces. The nearest rock showed no signs of scratches or scuffs that might indicate someone had been climbing or falling. The glasses lay precisely in the center of a small sandy area, as if they had been placed there deliberately. The distance between the two finds was 2 miles in a straight line across rugged, rocky terrain. On foot, this journey would take at least an hour for someone in good physical condition. But why would Howell need to go to such remote places? Search Operation Chief Dan McCarthy later admitted that the picture did not add up. An experienced hiker does not leave personal belongings in random places, especially a wallet and glasses, things without which it is impossible to continue hiking. By the 7th day of the search, the area had been expanded to 10 square miles. A helicopter, thermal imaging equipment, and additional specialists were brought in. The result remained the same. No trace of Howell himself. All hospitals within a 200-mile radius were checked. His family and colleagues in Denver were contacted, but no one had heard from Howell. His credit cards had not been used, and his cell phone was silent. On the 10th day, specialists in underground cavities joined the search. The Arches area is known for its hidden caves and sinkholes in the sandstone. Perhaps Howell had fallen into some unknown crevice. Speleologists explored all known caves within a 5-mile radius of the disappearance site. They used special equipment to search for hidden cavities. They found several small caves not previously marked on maps, but all of them were empty. After 2 weeks, the official search was called off. The case was reclassified as a disappearance under unexplained circumstances. Howell was declared missing. The family hired a private investigator from Denver. Detective Robert White conducted his own investigation, interviewed all the witnesses, and studied the area. His conclusions did not differ from the official ones. The man had disappeared without a trace. White noticed one detail that had been omitted from the official report. The Johnsons mentioned that on the morning of May 4th, before leaving on his route, Howell had received a phone call. He spoke quietly, and the conversation lasted several minutes. After the call, he looked worried. Call details showed an incoming call at 7 a.m. from a number registered to a non-existent name. The number was disconnected the day after Howell's disappearance. The mobile company was unable to provide additional information about the owner. This is the only mysterious detail in the case. Everything else looked like a normal disappearance in the wilderness, except for the strange location of the items found. A year later, volunteer search parties made another attempt. They expanded the area to 15 square miles and used new equipment. The result was the same: nothing. In 2011, another tourist disappeared in the same area. Michael Turner, 42, from Colorado, also went on a solo hike and did not return. His belongings were found in 3 different locations, several miles apart. Turner himself was not found. The park administration has not commented on a possible connection between the cases. Officially, each disappearance is treated as a separate incident. In 2015, a message from an anonymous user appeared on one of the forums for hiking enthusiasts. The author claimed to have worked as a ranger in Arches during the period of Howell's disappearance. He wrote about strange findings that were not included in the official reports. According to the anonymous user, rangers found traces of a campsite in the area where Howell's glasses were found. There was a ring from a campfire, flattened grass, and traces of a tent. However, this place was not marked as a permitted camping site on official maps. The post was deleted a few hours later. The park administration stated that it had no information about such findings. The case of Travis Howell remains open. His name has been added to the list of missing persons in national parks, a list that includes hundreds of names. The route to Double O Arch is still popular with tourists. Dozens of people walk it every day. Most return with the usual impressions of the beauty of the desert landscapes. But sometimes tourists report strange findings in remote parts of the park. Personal belongings in places where they shouldn't be. Traces of campsites where camping is prohibited. Rangers regularly receive such reports, but they are not officially recorded. What happened to Travis Howell on May 4th, 2009 remains a mystery. The only thing that is known for sure is that he left camp healthy that day and was never seen again. The desert keeps its secrets. In the endless stone labyrinths of Arches, it is easy to lose not only your way, but also all traces of human civilization. Perhaps this is what happened to the engineer from Denver, who one morning decided to take a walk to the picturesque arch and disappeared forever. Scott Myers went to the river to wash his face and never returned. His tracks ended at the water's edge, and an hour later his shirt was found on a branch 1,000 feet upstream. Divers searched for the body for 2 weeks and found nothing. In a calm summer river 5 feet deep, a man disappeared without a trace. Scott Myers worked as a sales manager for a construction company in Baltimore. He was 42 years old, married with 2 teenage children. Every summer he went camping with his younger brother Dan and his son. This time they chose Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. They set up camp at site number 27 in Big Meadows Campground on the evening of July 21st. They planned to spend 3 days there, exploring the surrounding trails. The weather was excellent, clear, warm, and rain-free. On the morning of the 22nd, they hiked to Dark Hollow Falls. Scott seemed to be in a good mood, joking with his nephew and taking pictures of the scenery. By evening, they returned to camp tired but happy. After dinner, around 8 p.m., Scott said he wanted to go down to the South Fork Shenandoah River. Their campsite was about 1/4 of a mile from the shore. He tried to wash up after a long day of hiking. His brother offered to accompany him, but Scott refused, saying he would be quick and return soon. Dan Myers remembers the exact time, 6:17 p.m. Scott took a towel, soap, and put on rubber flip-flops. The sun had not yet set, and visibility was good. The trail to the river was easy, well-trodden, with no difficult sections. Half an hour passed. Dan began to worry. Scott was a punctual man and always warned them if he was going to be late. By 9 o'clock in the evening, his concern had turned to alarm. Dan and his son went to the river to look for his brother. The path was clearly visible in the rays of the setting sun. There were no obstacles, no places where one could get lost or fall. At the riverbank, they found Scott's slippers. Both rubber flip-flops were standing on the shallow pebbles at the water's edge. One was standing upright, the other was turned on its side, as if it had been thrown off in a hurry. A towel and a bar of soap lay nearby. Dan called loudly for his brother. His voice carried across the quiet valley, but there was no answer. The river was calm at this point, about 5 feet deep, with a slow current. Visibility in the water was good. The bottom was visible throughout its entire depth. There was no sign of Scott in the water. At 9:30 p.m., Dan called the Rangers. The ranger on duty, Thomas Krieg, arrived 20 minutes later. He examined the scene, interviewed witnesses, and immediately began a search. The initial search was conducted with flashlights. They searched the shore upstream and downstream for half a mile in each direction. They shone lights into the water, checked the bushes, and examined possible places where a person could have slipped and fallen. There were no signs of a struggle on the shore. The pebbles were untouched, except for the place where the slate stood. There were no footprints in the soft earth at the water's edge. The next morning, the search operation was expanded. Additional rangers, volunteers, and search dogs were brought in. The dogs picked up the trail from the camp, reached the spot where the slippers were found, and lost it at the water's edge. An hour after the search began, they made a discovery. 1,000 feet from where the slate had been, on a low-hanging willow branch, she found a shirt. A blue cotton short-sleeved shirt that Scott had been wearing that evening. The shirt hung about 3 feet above the water. It looked as if it had been carried away by the current and caught on the branch. The fabric was damp but not soaked through. Finding the shirt upstream seemed logical, assuming that Scott had fallen into the water and been carried away by the current. But there were problems with this version. First, the current at that spot is very weak. The river flows slowly without rapids or whirlpools. A conscious person could easily have gotten to shore or at least grabbed onto something. Second, if Scott was carried downstream, how did the shirt end up upstream from where he entered the water? The head of the search operation, Captain Robert Steels, called in divers from Richmond. The specialists thoroughly searched the riverbed for 2 miles upstream and downstream from the point of disappearance. The riverbed is primarily sandy, with rocky areas in places. The depth is 5 to 7 feet. There are no deep holes where a body could get caught and stuck. There are no underwater obstacles or debris. The divers found nothing. By the 4th day of the search, it became clear that standard methods were not working. A helicopter was brought in for an aerial search. The area within a 5-mile radius of the disappearance site was surveyed. The pilot reported several suspicious objects in the forest. Still, a ground check showed that they were fallen trees and natural formations. On the 6th day, cave specialists joined the search. There are many limestone caves in the Shenandoah area, some of which are connected to underground waterways. A speleologist explored all known caves within a 3-mile radius. They found several small cavities, but all of them were dry and had no connection to the river. After a week, the official search was called off. The case was classified as a drowning, even though the body was not found. The family disagreed with the official version. Scott's wife, Linda, hired private divers. They conducted a more detailed survey of the riverbed using metal detectors and underwater cameras. The result was the same: nothing. Private investigator David Clark studied all the case files. One detail caught his attention. The official report mentioned that there were traces of dog hair on the shirt found on the branch. The Myers did not have a dog. There were also no tourists with large dogs registered at the campground during those days. The origin of the hair remained unclear. Clark interviewed other vacationers who were in the park at the time. A family from a neighboring state mentioned that they had seen a man with a large dog of an unknown breed by the river early in the morning on July 23, but they could not remember any details. This man was never identified. In 2014, a female tourist disappeared in the same area of the park. Maria Gonzalez from Washington went to the river to get water and did not return. Her belongings were found on the shore, but her body was not. Divers again found nothing. The park administration does not comment on the possible connection between the cases. Each disappearance is considered separately. Dan Myers still comes to Shenandoah every year on the anniversary of his brother's disappearance. He goes to that spot by the river and leaves flowers. He hopes to find some new clues or get some answers. Sometimes a person can disappear in the most ordinary places. A calm river, a well-trodden path, clear weather, and yet there are still only questions without answers. Wherever you are listening to this story, remember, nature is not always predictable, even when it seems safe. That's all for now, friends. Give it a thumbs up if you found it interesting, leave your comments, and see you in the following video. The national parks of the United States are not only about the beauty of wild nature and the grandeur of mountains, they are also places where people disappear as if they have been erased from reality itself. Tommy Nash walked just 500 feet away to get water and returned 2 months later, convinced that no more than 15 minutes had passed. Janet Woods vanished before her friend's eyes in the geothermal hell of Lassen, leaving behind only a burnt belt and barefoot tracks leading nowhere. And Jack Billings went out to meet the dawn in the mountains of Wyoming and stepped straight into the void. His tracks ended on a dry plateau. 3 weeks later, only a compass was found in the center of a dead circle. These stories have one thing in common. The more clues rescuers found, the less logic there was. For any parent, this is the ultimate fear. The moment when you look away, and when you look back, your child is gone. Usually this fear lasts for a few panicked seconds until you find them behind a nearby tree. But for the Nash family, those few seconds stretched into 2 endless months. In August 2011, 15-year-old Thomas Nash, whom everyone called Tommy, left his family's tent in Sequoia National Park to fetch water from a stream. The stream was only 500 feet away. He disappeared in less than 10 minutes. The search yielded only strange, impossible clues. His jacket stretched over a thin branch more than 10 feet high, and traces of foreign clay on it. Then, 62 days later, when all hope was lost, Tommy Nash emerged from the forest. He was in perfect condition, and horrified that his camp had disappeared. According to his own estimate, he had been gone no more than 15 minutes. The Nash family from Phoenix, Arizona had come to California for their summer vacation. They were not avid hikers, but rather an ordinary family who had decided to swap the desert landscapes for the coolness and grandeur of the giant forests of Sequoia National Park. In mid-August, they set up camp at one of the official campsites. The place was idyllic, giant sequoias resembling the columns of an ancient temple, the smell of pine needles, and the soothing murmur of a nearby stream. August 22nd was their second day in the park. Towards evening, when the sun began to set behind the treetops, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the family was busy setting up camp. Tommy's mother prepared dinner while his father built a fire. They needed fresh water from the stream that flowed just 500 feet from their tent. The path to it was clearly visible. 15-year-old Tommy volunteered to go. He took a plastic jug and a small LED flashlight, as dusk was already falling in the shade of the giant trees. His father told him to be careful and come back quickly. That was the last time they saw him for the next 2 months. His parents continued with their activities. They heard the sound of the stream and saw the last rays of sunlight filtering through the treetops. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Tommy's father, feeling slightly uneasy, called his name. There was no answer. He called again, louder. Silence. Only the crackling of the fire and the sound of water. His feeling of unease instantly turned to fear. His father grabbed a flashlight and ran down the path to the stream. The scene he saw there was both reassuring and frightening. Their plastic canister, half full, was standing on the bank of the stream. This meant that Tommy had reached his destination, but the boy himself was nowhere to be found. His father shouted his name again and again. His cries were drowned out by the vast, indifferent forest. Returning to the camp, he and his wife made the right decision to immediately raise the alarm. Fortunately, there was a caretaker at the campsite who contacted the Central Ranger Station by radio. Within an hour, the first rescuers arrived on the scene. As darkness fell, the search operation began. Powerful beams of light pierced the darkness, and people's voices echoed between the giant tree trunks. The night brought no results. At dawn, the search resumed with renewed vigor. Dozens of volunteers and dog handlers with dogs joined the operation. The area was combed methodically, square by square. The first discovery was made closer to noon, about 160 feet from the stream. Off the trail, Tommy's flashlight lay in the fallen pine needles. It was turned off. No damage, no signs of a struggle around it. It was just lying on the ground, as if it had been dropped or placed there. The dogs, which had picked up Tommy's trail at the stream, began to act restless when they reached this spot and eventually lost the trail. But the strangest and most inexplicable find awaited the searchers ahead. One of the volunteers, combing through the thick undergrowth, accidentally looked up and saw a bright blue spot on a young pine tree. It was Tommy's windbreaker, but how it got there defied any logical explanation. The jacket was stretched over a thin, flexible branch at a height that was later measured at almost 10.5 feet. The branch was too thin to support the weight of a teenager trying to climb a tree. He couldn't have thrown it there with such precision. It wasn't just caught on the branch. It was neatly placed there, as if someone or something of enormous height had taken it off the boy and hung it there. There was no damage to the jacket, but reddish clay smears were found on the sleeves and back. The rangers who examined the site were puzzled. They called in a geologist who worked in the park. His conclusion was categorical. The soil in this area is granite decay and loam. There is no clay of this reddish hue here, and there never has been. The nearest deposits of such clay were hundreds of miles away in a completely different geological zone. Thus, at the end of the first day of the search, the rescuers had 3 facts. The boy had disappeared, leaving behind a half-full canister of water. His flashlight was lying on the ground 160 feet from the stream, and his jacket, stained with foreign clay, was hanging on a thin branch more than 10 feet above the ground. None of these clues pointed to a typical case of a lost hiker. They all pointed to something strange, illogical, and frightening. The search continued, but no one could guess what turn this story would take. The strange clues, the jacket in the tree and the foreign clay, threw the search operation off track. Standard protocols proved useless. The theory that the boy had simply gotten lost fell apart. The animal attack theory also didn't hold up. There were no traces of blood or signs of a struggle. That left kidnapping. But this theory was also full of inconsistencies. Why would a kidnapper take off the victim's jacket and hang it 10 feet up? And how could he have slipped into the busy camp unnoticed and carried the teenager away just as unnoticed? Despite the oddities, the search continued with increasing intensity. Tommy Nash's story made national news. Hundreds of volunteers from all over California converged on the park. Groups on foot and horseback patrols combed the area, while helicopters circled above the treetops. A photograph of the smiling, freckled teenager was posted on every pole and in every store for hundreds of miles around. His grief-stricken parents appeared before the press every day, begging for their son to be returned to them or for any information. But the forest remained silent. Week after week passed, and no new clues emerged. No other items of clothing or traces were found. A vast search party, equipped with the most modern technology, combed through one of America's most famous national parks and could not find a single clue as to the boy's fate. It was like fighting a ghost. By the end of September, a month after his disappearance, the large-scale operation began to wind down. Professional rescuers were needed elsewhere. Volunteers in despair went home. Hope was fading. By mid-October, the search was officially called off. In his final report, the Tulare County Sheriff wrote that, despite unprecedented efforts, the whereabouts of Thomas Nash could not be determined. He was declared presumed dead. For his family, it was the worst possible verdict. A verdict without a body, without answers, without closure. And then, just as the story was beginning to fade into memory, becoming just another tragic statistic, something incredible happened. On October 23rd, 62 days after Tommy's disappearance, a truck driver stopped at a gas station on the highway leading out of the park. He saw a teenager walking confusedly along the side of the road. The boy was dressed in a thin t-shirt and jeans, clearly not suitable for the cool October weather. He looked scared and confused. The driver recognized him. It was the face from thousands of posters. It was Tommy Nash. He stopped the car and cautiously called out to the boy. Tommy approached him and asked a question that shocked the man. "Sir, do you know where everyone has gone? I went to the stream to get water, and when I came back, there was no tent, no parents, no car. Nothing." His voice was trembling. He was sure that no more than 20 minutes had passed since he left the camp. The driver immediately called 911. The news that Tommy Nash had been found alive spread like wildfire. It was like a miracle. His parents, who had already returned to Arizona to mourn their son, jumped up, and rushed to California. But the initial euphoria was followed by deep, disturbing confusion. When the first police officers arrived at the scene, they found Tommy in a state of extreme confusion. He repeated his story over and over again. He went to get water, filled his canister, and when he turned around, the camp was gone. He thought it was some kind of stupid prank. He shouted, calling for his parents, but no one answered. Then he got scared and followed a path that he thought would lead him to the road. He didn't walk far, maybe 10 minutes. One of the police officers, trying to clarify the situation, asked him a simple question. "Tommy, what day is it today?" Without hesitation, the boy replied, "August 22nd. At that moment, everyone present realized that they were dealing with something beyond their experience. They had to tell the teenager who had just lost his camp that it was already the end of October and that the whole country had been looking for him for 2 months. When Tommy heard this, he couldn't believe it. He looked at the police officers, the driver, the calendar in their car, and his face contorted with horror and complete incomprehension. For him, the world had just jumped 2 months into the future. His short walk for water had turned into a hole in time, and now he was on the other side of it. Tommy Nash was immediately taken to the hospital for a complete examination. The doctors, knowing that the boy had spent 2 months in the wild, expected to see exhaustion, dehydration, signs of frostbite, and dozens of other health problems. The results stunned them. The boy was in perfect condition. He hadn't lost a pound. Blood tests showed no signs of malnutrition or vitamin deficiency. His muscle tone was normal. There was nothing on his body except a few fresh scratches that could have been caused by walking through bushes. There were no insect bites, no severe cuts, no scars. From a medical point of view, there was no way he could have spent 62 days in the forests of Sierra Nevada. His physical condition matched his own account. He had been gone for only a few minutes. The best psychologists and psychiatrists worked with him. His story did not change one iota. He remembered in detail the morning of August 22nd, the road to the park, and setting up camp. His next conscious memory was standing by a stream, his camp gone. The 2-month gap simply did not exist for him. There was no black hole or vague images in his memory. There was only a smooth, seamless sequence of events from which a considerable chunk of time had fallen out. Time that the rest of the world had lived through. Official medicine and law enforcement had to provide some kind of explanation. The diagnosis was dissociative fugue with subsequent amnesia. According to this theory, some unknown traumatic factor caused Tommy to enter an altered state of consciousness. In this state, he allegedly lived for 2 months, somehow surviving. Then, when his consciousness returned to normal, his brain completely erased the memory of this traumatic period. But this theory, convenient for reports, did not explain anything. It did not explain his perfect physical condition. Even in a fugue state, a person must eat, drink, and protect themselves from the cold. It did not explain how a 15-year-old city teenager without equipment or skills could do this for 2 months. Most importantly, it did not explain the evidence, the jacket at a height of 10 feet and the clay from another region. There was another version, kidnapping. Supposedly, someone kidnapped Tommy, kept him somewhere for 2 months, fed him well and took care of him, and then, for some inexplicable reason, returned him. But this version also fell apart. No one demanded a ransom. The Nash family had no enemies. And again, why would a kidnapper hang a jacket on a tree? This scenario was even more absurd than the official diagnosis. The only version left was the one that no one dared to say out loud, but which everyone was thinking about. What if Tommy's story was the truth? What if he really was only gone for 15 minutes? What if he somehow stepped into a place where time flows differently? A place where the strange clay was left on his jacket, a place whose inhabitants, after returning him, left his coat behind as a peculiar sign, incomprehensible to us. The Thomas Nash case was closed. He returned home to his family. But his life was never the same again. He returned to a world that had moved on. He had to reacquaint himself with his friends and catch up on 2 months of schoolwork. To everyone else, he was a miracle, the boy who survived. But to himself, he was a man who had had 2 months of his life stolen, replaced by 15 minutes of horror and bewilderment. He never remembered what had happened to him. This story has no solution. There are only facts. time, place, and the state of a person. And these facts indicate that sometimes the boundaries of our reality become thinner than we think. And in the forests among the giant trees that stood here long before us, you can not only get lost in space, but also get lost in time. Lassen Volcanic National Park in California is a place where the Earth breathes. Here, hissing fumaroles release steam from the bowels of the planet, mud pots bubble with boiling sulfur, and the ground beneath your feet may be nothing more than a thin crust over a red-hot void. It is a landscape that is both mesmerizing and dangerously dangerous. Most tourists understand this threat and strictly follow the marked trails. Janet Woods understood it better than anyone else. At 34, she was an experienced guide and knew the mountains like the back of her hand. But on a clear September day, on a trail near the Bumpass Hell geothermal area, she disappeared. Her friend had turned away for just 10 minutes. When she looked back, Janet was gone. The search yielded nothing but two eerie, inexplicable finds: a burnt backpack strap 1.5 miles from where there was no sign of fire, and a trail of barefoot footprints on sharp volcanic rock leading to nowhere. It was an easy hike for them. Both women were in excellent physical shape, and Janet in particular had extensive hiking experience. She had led groups through the Sierra Nevada, knew the canyons of Utah, and had been to the wildest corners of California more than once. She was the kind of person who always brought the right equipment, checked the weather forecast, and never took unnecessary risks. Their destination was the Bumpass Hell Trail, one of the most famous in the park. The route consists of wooden walkways laid over boiling and steaming ground. Warning signs are posted everywhere, urging visitors to stay on the trail. Janet and Sarah walked most of the way, stopping at a lookout point overlooking the main pool. The landscape was surreal: yellow sulfur deposits, columns of steam, and a low rumbling coming from underground. It was around 2 in the afternoon. They decided to take a short break. They took off their backpacks. Sarah, who was into photography, decided that a spot a little higher up the slope, about 100 feet away, would offer the best view for a panoramic shot. She told Janet about it. Janet replied that she would wait by the backpacks and drink some water. They were on a safe, well-trodden section of the trail, far from dangerous geothermal areas. What happened next is known only from Sarah's account. She climbed onto a small ledge, took out her camera, and began adjusting the lens. She remembers fiddling with the settings for a few minutes, trying to get the lighting right. Then she took a few pictures. The whole process took, by her estimate, no more than 10 to 15 minutes. They were within sight of each other the entire time, even though Sarah was focused on the camera. When she finished and turned to call Janet, the spot where her friend had been sitting was empty. Her bright blue backpack was gone too. Sarah's first thought was perfectly mundane. Janet must have gone ahead on the trail or decided to return to the start of the route to wait for her. Sarah called her name. There was no answer. She shouted louder. The only response was the hissing of fumaroles and the whistling of the wind. Sarah went back to where they had stopped. Nothing. No note. No sign. She waited another 10 minutes, sure that she would soon see Janet coming toward her. But no one appeared. Her slight confusion began to turn into anxiety. She walked a little further along the trail, then returned to the start of the route. She asked other hikers if they had seen a woman in a green jacket with a blue backpack. No one had seen anything. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Sarah was in a state of absolute panic. She made her way to the ranger station and reported her friend missing. The initial reaction was cautious. An adult, experienced hiker. Most likely a misunderstanding. They had simply passed each other. The rangers checked the parking lot. Janet's silver Subaru was still there. This was a bad sign. As dusk fell, a full-scale search and rescue operation was launched. Teams of rangers and volunteers began combing the Bumpass Hell Trail and adjacent routes. The night yielded no results. The search from the air was hampered by the rugged terrain, and the use of thermal imaging cameras proved useless. The entire area was glowing due to geothermal activity. One day passed, then another. The search expanded to cover larger areas. The result was zero. Investigators were at a loss. How could an experienced guide disappear from a busy trail on a clear day within 10 minutes, leaving absolutely no trace? There were no signs of a struggle. No one heard any cries for help. Search dogs brought to the spot where Janet was last seen picked up her scent, but it was lost after a few dozen feet on the rocky trail trampled by hundreds of other hikers. The theory that she had fallen into one of the mud pots was one of the first to be considered. But this seemed unlikely. She was sitting in a safe place, and to reach the nearest danger zone, she would have had to deliberately leave the trail and walk a considerable distance. In addition, such an incident would most likely have left some traces. A dropped item, skid marks, perhaps a scream that others would have heard. But there was nothing. Janet Woods and her backpack had simply vanished. The search team leader wrote in his report at the end of the second day, "The situation defies logical explanation. The lack of any clues is unprecedented." They did not yet know that the first and strangest clue would be found the next day. On the third day of the search, when hope of finding Janet alive had all but faded, one of the search teams combing a remote area 1.5 miles north of the Bumpus Hell Trail made a strange discovery. It was a difficult-to-reach area, overgrown with sparse forest and covered with solidified lava rock. One of the volunteers noticed a small dark object on the ground. Coming closer, he realized it was a piece of nylon strap with a plastic buckle. Sarah Green, who was later shown the find, immediately recognized it. It was the waist strap from Janet's backpack, but the condition of the belt shocked everyone. It was badly burned and partially melted. The edges were charred, and the plastic buckle was deformed from the high temperature. The most inexplicable thing was that the belt was lying on dry pine needles, dozens of feet from the nearest rock outcrops. There were absolutely no signs of fire around it. No ashes, no burnt grass, no scorched branches on the trees. There were no traces of a recent lightning strike either. An unanswerable question arose. How could this belt have burned here without leaving any traces of fire around it? It was as if it had been burned somewhere else and then brought and thrown here. Or it had been exposed to some kind of local, extremely high heat source right at this spot. Neither version made sense. This discovery prompted the searchers to focus their efforts on this area. The teams began combing the area with redoubled attention, and a few hours later, about 1,000 feet from where the belt was found, a second, even more disturbing discovery was made. On an open section of the slope covered with acceptable sharp volcanic debris, the searchers discovered a chain of footprints. They were barefoot human footprints. The size matched Janet's foot size. The footprints were clear, indicating that the person who left them was either very heavy or moved slowly, pressing their feet deeply into the ground. But the very existence of these footprints was absurd. Why would an experienced hiker with sturdy hiking boots walk barefoot on the sharpest rocks? Walking barefoot here would not only be painful, but agonizing. Each foot would be cut to the bone, but there were no traces of blood near the footprints. And as in other similar cases, this story had its point of no return. After about 160 feet up the slope, the chain of barefoot tracks simply ended. It ended on a flat, open area of ground. There were no signs that Janet had fallen, sat down, or tried to grab onto anything. The last print of her left foot, and then completely untouched ground. It was as if she had taken one previous step and flown away. These two pieces of evidence, the burnt belt and the barefoot footprints leading nowhere, left investigators at a complete dead end. They did not bring them any closer to solving the mystery. On the contrary, they led them into the realm of complete irrationality. On the fourth day, the active search was called off. The park had been combed, and all possible scenarios had been explored. Janet Woods was officially declared missing under unexplained circumstances. The case was never solved. It joined the list of strange and unexplained disappearances in U.S. national parks. What happened to Janet Woods in those 10 minutes? Why did she take off her shoes and walk on sharp rocks? And what kind of heat source turned her backpack strap into a burnt piece of plastic without affecting anything around it? There are still no answers to these questions. There are only facts. The woman disappeared, and the clues she left behind defy the laws of logic and physics. The story of Janet Woods serves as a grim reminder that even in the most studied and popular places, There are mysteries that the human mind cannot comprehend. Some rituals connect a person with nature. For 52-year-old Jack Billings, one such ritual was watching the sunrise. An experienced hiker, he believed that the first rays of the sun touching the mountain peaks were a sight worth living for. In July 1991, while hiking in the Wind River Range in Wyoming, he left his tent in the pre-dawn mist, as usual, to take his short walk. His brother saw him leave. 40 minutes later, he had not returned. His footprints, clearly imprinted on the trail, led up the slope and simply ended on a flat, dry patch of ground, as if the man had been lifted out of the sky. 23 days later, 11 miles away, the only and last discovery was made. His pocket compass, lying in the center of a perfect circle of dead grass. Jack Billings was never found. He went out to meet the dawn and seemed to have stepped right into it. The Wind River Range in Wyoming is no place for beginners. It is a harsh, wild land of granite peaks, glacial cirques, and thousands of nameless lakes. Here the weather can change in a matter of minutes, and the nearest civilization is days away on foot. For brothers Jack and Mark Billings, it was a home away from home. They had walked these trails back and forth for 20 years. Jack, who was 52, was the brains of their tandem. Methodical, cautious, he planned every route down to the smallest detail. Mark, 10 years younger, had the strength and endurance. At the end of July 1991, they set up camp in a valley at the foot of an unnamed peak. It was the 5th day of their 2-week hike. On the morning of the 6th day, as always, Jack woke up before everyone else. The clock read 5:30 a.m. The sky in the east was just beginning to lighten. Mark, who had also woken up from the cold, watched his brother zip up his light windbreaker and check the laces on his boots. "I'm going to the ridge to watch the sunrise," Jack said quietly. It was his tradition. He took only a small notebook, a pen, and a pocket compass with him. He liked to make short notes about his morning walks. Mark nodded and wrapped himself back in his sleeping bag. He heard his brother's footsteps, receding. The camp was once again plunged into silence, broken only by the whistling of the wind. About 40 minutes passed. The sun had already risen from behind the distant peaks, flooding the valley with golden light. Jack should have been back by now. Mark climbed out of the tent to light the coffee burner. He looked at the ridge, expecting to see his brother's figure descending, but it was empty. An hour passed. Mark began to worry. Jack was as punctual as clockwork. It wasn't like him to be late. Mark picked up his portable radio and called his brother. "Jack, this is Mark. Come in." All he heard in response was static. He tried several more times. The result was the same. Now his concern turned to real alarm. Maybe he had twisted his ankle? Fallen? Mark decided to follow his tracks. They were perfectly clear in the thin morning air on the dusty trail. Jack's boot prints led from the tent up the slope, along a well-trodden animal trail. Mark walked quickly, looking around carefully. He walked about half a mile, almost reaching the ridge. Here the trail led to a small flat plateau, a level, dry area covered with fine dust and stones. And here something happened that Mark Billings would never forget for the rest of his life. His brother's tracks reached the middle of this area and stopped. They weren't smudged or turned to the side. The last clear print of the right boot, and then absolutely flat, untouched dust. Mark walked around the spot several times. There were no signs of a struggle, no animal tracks, no scree or cracks in the ground where he could have fallen. No signs that his brother had tried to stop, turn around, or run. The tracks just ended. It was as if Jack had taken a step and vanished. In horror, Mark rushed back to camp. He tried again and again to call someone on the radio, but in this wilderness it was useless. In 1991, ordinary tourists did not have satellite phones. He realized that he would have to find his own way to civilization. Gathering the bare minimum, he left the camp untouched. He began the agonizing 2-day descent to the nearest ranger station. When he finally told his story, exhausted and frightened, they looked at him with disbelief. But a person's disappearance in Wind River is a serious matter. A search and rescue operation was immediately organized. A day later, the ranger team, along with Mark, reached the abandoned camp. Then they followed Jack's tracks to the plateau. An experienced tracker from the team confirmed Mark's words. The scene was inexplicable. The next day, dog handlers with the best search dogs were brought to the camp. The dog confidently picked up Jack's trail from the tent. She led the group precisely along the chain of his tracks, eagerly sniffing the ground. But when she reached the middle of the dry plateau, she stopped abruptly. She whimpered, tucked her tail between her legs, and began to circle in place. The trail had disappeared. The scent of the man who had been there simply broke off at one specific point. For everyone present, it was chilling confirmation. Something had happened that was beyond the scope of their many years of experience. The search operation in the Wind River Range lasted more than 3 weeks. It was one of the most extensive searches in the history of Wyoming. Dozens of rescuers, volunteers, and several helicopters combed square after square of hundreds of square miles of territory. The epicenter of the search was the very plateau where the tracks ended. Rescuers searched every rock, every crack in the rocks, but they found nothing. Not a scrap of fabric, not a dropped notebook, not a trace of blood. Jack Billings had vanished without a trace. Gradually, the search was called off. Jack was officially declared missing, presumed dead as a result of an accident. But in private conversations, rescuers admitted that they had never encountered a case like this before. The story of the tracks leading nowhere became their internal folklore, a dark legend told to new recruits. Then, on the 23rd day after Jack's disappearance, when the main rescue team had already left the area, another strange event occurred. 2 geologists conducting research in a completely different remote part of the ridge, about 11 miles in a straight line from the site of the disappearance, stumbled upon an anomaly. They were on top of an old, weathered rock with no trails leading to it. The place was wild and rarely visited. On the flat top of this rock, they saw an almost perfect circle about 3 feet in diameter. Inside this circle, all the sparse vegetation, grass and lichens, was dead, dry, and brown, while everything around it was green. It did not look like the remains of a campfire. The ground was not scorched. It looked more like it had been dried out, stripped of life. But the most striking thing was in the center of this circle. There, on the bare rock, lay a small metal object, glistening in the sun. Coming closer, the geologists realized that it was an old brass pocket compass. It was undamaged and lay as if someone had carefully placed it there. There were no tracks around it. The geologists reported their find by radio. When the compass was brought back to base, it was shown to Mark Billings. He recognized it immediately. It was his brother's compass, the one Jack always carried in his pocket. This discovery did not provide any answers. It raised even more questions. How did Jack's compass end up 11 miles from where he disappeared, in an area that was virtually impossible to reach? How did it end up in the center of a perfectly flat circle of dead grass? What was this circle? Was it a side effect of what happened to Jack, or was it some kind of message? None of these questions was ever answered. No other belongings or traces of Jack Billings were found. His body was never found. The official case was closed, but the mystery remained. And that's it. 3 stories, 3 tragedies, and not a single answer. A jacket in a tree, foreign clay, a burnt belt, barefoot tracks, disappearing tracks on the plateau, a compass in a circle of dead grass. Each detail seemed to deliberately pull the rug out from under the searchers' feet, leaving only cold horror and the realization that there are forces at work in these places that humans cannot comprehend. If you found this interesting, subscribe, and write in the comments which of these stories you found most inexplicable. There are even more mysteries and disappearances ahead. You don't miss them. Imagine this: a sunny day, a safe trail in a national park, dozens of witnesses around. You smile at a passerby and keep walking, and no one ever sees you again. That's how Julie Taylor, a teacher from Montana, disappeared. Her body was later found on an inaccessible cliff ledge that she could not have reached on her own. And now, a man who had been afraid of heights his entire life. Martin Sloan went to a stream in the Great Smoky Mountains to get water. 12 days later, he was found dead in a cave on a 15-foot cliff which he would never have dared to climb while alive. Rescuers swore that they had checked the cave in the first few days and it was empty. And finally, there was student Aaron Beck. He had only gone to take a picture of the landscape on Mount Hood. 6 months later, his body was found sitting on a stone arch high in the mountains, a place he could not have reached without equipment. His shoes and clothes were in perfect condition, as if he had never gone there. 3 different people, 3 different stories, but they have one thing in common. They disappeared in the most ordinary crowded places. They were then found in a location where no human could have arrived on their own. Coincidence, mistake, or proof that there are forces in national parks that we cannot explain? Julie Taylor was not one to take reckless risks. 43 years old, she was an elementary school teacher from Bozeman, Montana. Colleagues and friends described her as responsible, methodical, and calm. She loved nature and often spent her vacations hiking, but always chose well-known, well-marked trails. She was not a mountaineer or an extreme sports enthusiast. For her, hiking was a way to be in silence and enjoy the beauty. In early July 1996, she came to Colorado for a week's vacation. Her destination was Rocky Mountain National Park. On a clear and warm Tuesday, July 2nd, she decided to hike the Emerald Lake Trail. This is one of the park's most famous routes, a scenic trail just over 3 miles long, leading past 3 crystal-clear mountain lakes. In the height of summer, it is always crowded with families with children, tourists, and photographers. It is not the kind of wilderness where you can easily get lost. In the morning, Julie parked her car in the parking lot at the trailhead. She was wearing comfortable hiking clothes, good boots, and a small backpack, which, as it later turned out, contained 2 bottles of water, sandwiches, an apple, a map, and a light jacket. She was ready for a typical day's walk. The last person to see her alive was a witness whose testimony became crucial in the case. He was an amateur photographer who had set up his tripod at a lookout point overlooking Dream Lake, approximately halfway along the trail. Around 11 a.m., Julie approached the lookout point. The photographer recalled that she looked peaceful and happy. They exchanged a few words about the beautiful weather and scenery. She stood for a few minutes admiring the view, then politely thanked the photographer for the brief conversation, turned, and continued up the trail toward Emerald Lake. He watched her go and returned to his camera. This was the last confirmed sighting of Julie Taylor. From the point where she spoke to the photographer to the final destination of the route, Emerald Lake, it was no more than a 20-minute walk. There is only one trail there, well-trodden with no forks. On both sides of it were steep slopes and dense forest. Dozens of people were walking along the route that day. However, none of those questioned later remembered seeing a lone woman in a blue windbreaker walking towards or passing them. The alarm was raised the next day. Julie did not return to the motel where she had booked a room. The manager, knowing that she was traveling alone and remembering that she was going hiking, contacted the park service. Rangers quickly found her car in the parking lot. It was a bad omen. A search operation was immediately launched. In the early days, the Rangers were optimistic. Disappearances on such a busy and easy trail usually end quickly. The hiker twisted an ankle and strayed a few feet off the trail or got dizzy. Rescue teams methodically combed every foot of the trail and the surrounding area. They looked under every rock and bush, but they found nothing. The search expanded. Helicopters and dog handlers were brought in, but even that yielded no results. The dogs lost the trail on the path, where the smells of hundreds of other hikers mingled. From the air, nothing could be seen in the dense forest and on the rocky slopes. A week passed. The search continued, but hope was fading. Rescuers and investigators were completely baffled. It was illogical. A person cannot simply vanish from a trail in the middle of the day without leaving a single trace. No dropped items, no footprints on the ground, no witnesses. The Julie Taylor case was turning into one of those stories that rangers tell each other on quiet evenings. A story about the ghost of the mountain. After 2 weeks, having found no clues, the active phase of the search had to be called off. 3 weeks after Julie's disappearance, when the official search had already been called off, something happened that turned the whole case upside down. A helicopter pilot making a routine flight over the park to monitor wildlife was flying over the rock massif, towering above Dream Lake. He happened to glance at the sheer granite wall and noticed something that shouldn't have been there, a small colored spot. He descended to get a better look and realized it was a human body lying on a narrow ledge. The coordinates were relayed to the ground. An exceptional mountain rescue team was called in to evacuate the body. The location of the body was virtually inaccessible. It was a narrow, no more than 3 feet wide, rock ledge on a sheer wall. It could only be reached with climbing equipment, rappelling down from above. There was no way up from below, only a smooth granite wall several hundred feet high. When the rescuers descended onto the ledge, they found Julie Taylor's body. The scene they saw was surreal and frightening in its serenity. Julie was lying on her back, her arms folded along her body. Her eyes were closed. Her face wore a calm, almost peaceful expression. Her backpack lay next to her. There were no visible injuries to her clothing or body, no broken bones, no abrasions, no bruises that would have been inevitable from a fall, even from a low height. One of the rescuers later said in an unofficial report that he had the feeling as if someone had very carefully placed her there. An examination of the backpack only added to the mystery. 2 bottles of water were almost empty. The food, sandwiches and an apple, was untouched. This completely refuted the theory that she had gotten lost and wandered around the mountains for a long time. She did not die of hunger or thirst. The body was evacuated with great difficulty and sent for examination. The coroner's report was the final nail in the coffin of logical explanations. The cause of death was listed as hypothermia, excessive cooling. At night in the mountains, even in summer, the temperature can drop to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. But the report specifically emphasized the complete absence of any injuries preceding death. There were no signs of a fall, struggle, or violence. Investigators were faced with a set of impossible facts. A woman with no climbing equipment somehow ended up on an inaccessible rock ledge 1,000 feet above the trail. She did not fall there, nor did she climb up there herself. She died of hypothermia, even though she had food, water, and a warm jacket in her backpack. The official version that was eventually announced was absurd. Still, it was the only one the authorities could offer. Death as a result of an accident caused by sudden disorientation. This wording explained nothing. It did not answer the central question, how did she get there? The Julie Taylor case remains unsolved. It has become one of the strangest mysteries in the history of Rocky Mountain National Park. There was no criminal and no apparent accident. There was only a quiet, peaceful death in a place where no one could have been. The story of her disappearance and discovery serves as a grim reminder that the mountains hold secrets that are far beyond our understanding, and that sometimes the scariest thing is not what can be explained, but what simply cannot be explained. Great Smoky Mountains National Park is one of the most visited wilderness areas in the United States, but its dense forests and misty valleys know how to keep secrets. In the fall of 1996, biologist Martin Sloan, a man who had dedicated his life to studying nature, became part of one such mystery. He left his tent to fetch water from a stream and never returned. 12 days later, his body was found in a place that defies all logic, in a small cave, almost 15 feet up on a sheer cliff. It was impossible to get there without equipment, especially for a man who, according to his wife, was terrified of heights. But that's not even the most terrifying part of this story. The scariest thing is that the rescuers who found him swore they had already checked that cave in the early days of the search, and at that time it was empty. Martin Sloan was 56 years old and a scientist. As a biologist, he was accustomed to observing, analyzing, and finding rational explanations for everything he saw. He did not believe in superstitions and was not prone to panic. For him, nature was not a hostile element, but a complex yet knowable system. He and his wife Eleanor had spent decades together traveling and camping in various parts of the country. They were experienced tourists who knew how to behave in the wilderness. Martin had one secret that only his closest friends knew about. He suffered from acrophobia, a severe fear of heights. It wasn't just a slight nervousness. According to Eleanor, he couldn't stand at the edge of a cliff. He felt physically ill on high bridges, and he would never willingly climb even a low rock. This fact is key to understanding the absurdity of what happened. On the 14th of September 1996, Martin and Eleanor pitched their tent at one of the campsites deep in the park. The place was quiet but not entirely isolated. The evening passed quietly. They had dinner sitting by a small fire and discussed their plans for the next day. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, when it was already completely dark, they ran out of drinking water. The stream was nearby and its murmur could be heard clearly. Martin took a flashlight and an empty canister and told his wife that he would be back in 5 minutes. Eleanor saw the beam of his flashlight disappear behind the trees. She stayed by the tent reading a book by the light of her flashlight. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Martin did not return. Eleanor put down her book and called out to him. The only response was the rustling of leaves and the sound of the stream. She shouted louder. Silence. A cold, unpleasant feeling began to grow inside her. She took her flashlight and walked along the path to the stream. She found nothing on the bank. Neither Martin nor the canister was there. All night long she frantically searched the nearby forest, calling her husband until she was hoarse. At dawn, exhausted and frightened, she managed to reach the ranger station and report his disappearance. The search operation began immediately. Rangers and volunteers began combing the area. It was a standard scenario. Most likely the man had slipped in the dark by the stream, fallen into a ravine, and couldn't get out. Teams methodically searched every foot of ground, the stream bed, and the thickets. On the second day of the search, one of the groups was working in a ravine near the elephant camp. One of the young rescuers, following instructions, was scanning all the rocky ledges and crevices with binoculars for traces or snagged clothing. His attention was drawn to a dark hole in the rock, a small cave opening about 15 feet above the ground. He scrutinized it with his binoculars as far as possible. Seeing nothing suspicious, he made a note in his logbook. Crevice on the north slope of the gorge, height approximately 15 feet. Inspected, empty. This brief entry, made on the second day of the search, would later become the central and most frightening detail of the case. Days passed, but the search yielded no results. No canister, no flashlight, no traces were found. The dogs lost Martin's trail at the edge of the water. It seemed as if he had simply walked up to the stream and vanished. After a week, hope of finding him alive faded. The operation switched to a search for his body. Eleanor, crushed by grief, refused to leave the park. On the 12th day after his disappearance, one of the search teams decided to retrace the original route, re-examining key points along the way. They found themselves back in that same ravine. One of the rescuers, the same one who had already examined the rock, stopped and raised his binoculars again. Later, he couldn't explain what made him do it. It was just a sixth sense. He focused his optics on the dark hole in the rock again, but this time it seemed to him that there was something inside, something that wasn't there before. To check it out, they had to call in a special team. Getting to the cave was extremely difficult. The rock face was almost vertical, with no handholds to be found. The rescuers had to set up safety equipment and lower one of them down on a rope from above. When he finally reached the opening and looked inside, he transmitted just 2 words over the radio to the ground. "I found him." Martin Sloan was lying in this shallow cave, but the way he was lying was completely unnatural. He was on his back in a perfectly straight position, his arms stretched out at his sides like a soldier. His clothes were clean, without tears or dirt. There were no signs of a fall, struggle, or wounds on his body. There was no blood, either on him or on the cave floor. His face was calm. There was no canister or flashlight next to him. The scene looked as if someone had brought him here already dead and carefully placed him in this stone niche. When the rescuer who found the body climbed down, he was pale. He approached the group leader and said that this was impossible. He was sure, absolutely sure, that 10 days ago when he had inspected this cave, it had been empty. His words were confirmed by an entry in the logbook. Martin's body was evacuated and sent for examination. The coroner's report only raised more questions. The cause of death was hypothermia. The time of death could not be determined with certainty, but it was presumed that he had died several days before his body was found. There were no signs of violence, no injuries, no signs of a fall. The official investigation had reached a complete dead end. They had a set of facts that contradicted each other in common sense. How could a man with a panic fear of heights end up in a cave on a 15-foot cliff? How could he have climbed there without leaving a single trace on the rock? No scratches from his boots, no broken branches. Why was his body laid out in such a strange, formal position? And the most critical, chilling question, if the rescuers' first report was correct, where was Martin Sloan during the first days of the search? And what force placed his body in an already searched, empty place? The official conclusion was predictably vague and unsatisfactory. Death as a result of an accident under unclear circumstances. Unofficially, among rescuers and rangers, the case became legendary. A legend about a man who went out for water and was returned 12 days later. He was not returned to where he had disappeared, but placed on display like an exhibit in a stone showcase where he himself would never have been able or willing to climb. In October 2008, a group of students from Portland University went on a weekend hike. The event was a planned outing organized by the university's hiking club, led by an experienced instructor. One of the participants was Aaron Beck, a 19-year-old sophomore. He was not a professional climber, but he loved nature and was in good physical shape. For him, as for the others, it was simply an opportunity to take a break from their studies and enjoy the beauty of the autumn mountains. The group was following a well-known route in the Mount Hood area. The weather was typical for an Oregon autumn, cool with variable cloud cover. During the afternoon, while resting at a small mountain lake, Aaron left the leading group. According to other students, he said he wanted to take some pictures from a small rock ledge that was off the trail, just a few hundred feet away. The instructor gave him permission, but told him not to stay too long and to remain within earshot. That was the last time he was seen. 10 minutes later, when the group was ready to continue, Aaron was not there. The instructor called his name. There was no response. They waited another 15 minutes, calling out periodically, but there was only silence in response. At that moment, the weather began to deteriorate. Thick fog rolled down from the top of the mountain, reducing visibility to a few feet. Realizing that the situation was becoming dangerous, the instructor made the difficult decision to lead the main group back to camp and call for help. A large-scale search and rescue operation was launched that same evening, but it was doomed to failure from the start. The fog gave way to freezing rain, and the next day the first heavy snowfall hit the mountain, which forecasters had predicted would not happen for another week. The search had to be called off. Mount Hood donned its winter shroud, and everyone understood that it would not reveal its secrets until spring. Aaron Beck was officially declared missing. It was assumed that he had gotten lost, been caught in bad weather, and frozen to death somewhere in the forest. It was a tragic, but unfortunately typical story for these parts. 6 long months passed. May 2009 arrived. The snow in the mountains began to melt, revealing the ground, and the hill gave back what it had taken. Aaron's body was discovered by chance by 2 climbers who were ascending a challenging, rarely used route far from any tourist trails. They saw him from a distance, a dark figure sitting on top of a narrow, natural stone arch that connected 2 rocky peaks. When rescuers arrived at the scene, they were confronted with a sight that defied description. Aaron Beck sat on the rock, leaning forward slightly. His hands were in the pockets of his light jacket. His eyes were open and staring straight ahead at the valley below. He was not lying down, nor was he curled up from the cold. He was sitting in a calm, patient waiting position. The location where he was found was 5 miles in a straight line from the group's camp, and at an altitude of 8,500 feet. To get there, one had to cross several canyons, dense forest, and climb steep, rocky slopes. Aaron had no ice axe, no ropes, no other climbing equipment. Even for an experienced climber, such a route would be a serious challenge. For an ordinary student, it was practically impossible. But the most striking thing was something else. When the body was evacuated, investigators examined his clothes and shoes. His hiking boots, which should have been worn to shreds after a 5-mile trek over such terrain, were in almost perfect condition. There were virtually no signs of wear on the soles, and only minor scuffs on the leather. His jeans and jacket were also not torn or heavily soiled. It was physically impossible. The evidence clearly indicated that he had not walked to that location. The coroner's report was predictable. The cause of death was hypothermia. The time of death was approximately 6 months ago, shortly after his disappearance. No injuries, fractures, or signs of violence were found on the body. The official investigation was closed, leaving a vacuum behind. How could a 19-year-old guy without equipment end up on an inaccessible rock arch? Why did his clothes and shoes bear no traces of this impossible journey? And the most important, most terrifying mystery, why was he sitting? Victims of hypothermia fall into unconsciousness, curl up in a fetal position trying to stay warm. They do not sit in an observer's position. The unofficial theories that emerged after this incident were each more disturbing than the last. Some of the rescuers who participated in the operation said that it looked as if he had simply been placed, or sat there, as if he had been brought to this arch by some unknown force that left no traces. His posture is not that of a victim, but that of a witness to something he saw in his last moments. And it is stories like these that make us wonder, what are America's national parks really hiding? People disappear among crowds of tourists, return to places other than where they left, or end up in places they could not physically have gone. Rational explanations sound increasingly fragile, and the mysteries only multiply. That's all for now. If you found this interesting, subscribe, and write in the comments which of these stories you find the most terrifying. There are even more mysterious cases ahead that still remain unanswered.